Of all the Sophists, Protagoras was not only one of the first, but perhaps also the greatest. The fact that he is grouped with the Sophists instead of the pre-Socratics may simply be thanks to the prejudice of Plato, since later philosophers such as the skeptic Sextus Empiricus considered him to be the founder of a philosophy rather than just a teacher of rhetoric. It seems very fitting that the philosopher who was famous for teaching his students to argue both sides of a debate also seemed to fit on both sides of the sophist-philosopher divide. His claim that man is the measure of all things has been seen as the first expression of relativism, a school of philosophy which claims that things like knowledge, truth, and morality are not absolute and objective, but are subjective and relative to our context. Thanks to Plato, this has become the standard interpretation of his philosophy. But as we'll see, this may not be an entirely correct interpretation. He may have thought that all arguments had an aspect of truth to them, but that doesn't mean he didn't think that some things were more true than others. Hey, I'm Matt, you're watching Nothing New, and today we're talking about one of the most important and provocative of the Sophists, Protagoras. Compared to the almost totalitarian political views of Plato, Protagoras was profoundly democratic. In classical Athens, there was a lively debate around the virtues that make someone a good citizen, and whether it was innate or could be taught. Protagoras was one of the first thinkers in history to argue that virtue in fact could be taught, which meant that everyone could learn the skills required for political participation. But while his philosophy seems to be radically democratic and critical to the norms of the time, we'll see that he may have been more of a utilitarian than an outright skeptic. But before we get into it, want to see more videos on ancient philosophy and culture? Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We have new videos coming out every week. Anyways, let's get into it. We should start by first asking, what exactly is a sophist? Aristotle defined a sophist as someone who makes money by apparent but not genuine wisdom. This is a surprising definition for what originally just meant a wise man. Sophia is Greek for wisdom after all. So how did it gain its current connotation of someone who uses false arguments to deceive people and earn money? This change in meaning is almost entirely thanks to Plato, who had a very low opinion of the Sophists. We'll explore Plato's criticism of the Sophists later, but first, let's establish the basic features that made someone a Sophist. Primarily, they were itinerant teachers of a variety of subjects, such as music, math, or even athletics. The most common subject they taught, however, was rhetoric. But the most famous and successful Sophists often claimed that they taught not just rhetoric, but political virtue itself. That is, they claimed to teach arete, which I want to say is the highest virtue of classical Greece, but that's not exactly right. Arete was virtue itself, and is often translated simply as virtue or excellence. The conception of virtue in ancient Greece involved living up to one's potential, and using all your innate talent to achieve results. The heroes of Greece are not just the bravest, but the most effective. A great example is Odysseus. To a modern reader like me, he seems a strange choice to be such a huge hero in ancient Greek culture. He's more of a trickster than a saint. But that's exactly what the Greeks admired about him. Wily Odysseus uses every trick he has to achieve his goals, and when you look at it from an ancient perspective, there's a lot to admire in his wit and cunning. The world has never been a paradise, and rocky Greece in particular must have been an especially harsh place to live. So as we discussed in the Greek miracle video, it required the people of Greece to be clever. Bravery and strength are fine and good, but it's our ability to adapt and be creative in new situations which has truly enabled humanity to flourish across the planet. So if arete was not just excellence, but effectiveness, the arete that one would learn under the tutelage of a sophist was often how to be effective in politics. In fact, it's around this time that the meaning of arete became more about political success through rhetorical persuasion, as compared to the old Homeric usage, which generally meant strength and courage. So we can see why there was a debate as to whether they actually taught virtue or simply rhetoric. Since again, virtue was tightly linked to effectiveness. We're going to see the debate of whether virtue is innate or a teachable skill play out across the dialogues of Plato. But to get a general understanding of how the citizens of Athens viewed the Sophists, let's turn to Aristophanes' play, The Clouds. In this play, a father enrolls his son in a local school, the Thinkery, in order to beat his creditors in court and get out of his debt. The school teaches many absurd things, such as the distance jumped by a flea, called a flea's foot, or where the buzzing sound of gnats comes from. But primarily it taught students to turn bad arguments into winning arguments. When the son graduates, however, he is not only able to beat the creditors in court, but ends up beating his own father. Literally, he physically assaults his father, and then beats him even in debate, persuasively arguing against the traditional view that it is right for fathers to beat sons, but not the other way around. When he threatens to attack his mother, the father leads an angry mob to burn down the thinkery. As we mentioned last week in our video on the trial of Socrates, this play was famous for caricaturing not just the Sophists in general, but Socrates in particular. In fact, Socrates is the leader of the thinkery in the play, but as we know, and we'll explore further in later videos, there were a few key points that differentiated Socrates from the Sophists, not least being the fact that he didn't charge like others did. But that doesn't mean the average citizen would have been able to tell the difference between Socrates and the Sophists. As the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, Aristophanes' depiction of Socrates the Sophist is revealing on at least 3 levels. In the first instance, it demonstrates that the distinction between Socrates and his sophistic counterparts was far from clear to their contemporaries. Although Socrates did not charge fees and frequently asserted that all he knew was that he was ignorant of most matters, his association with the Sophists reflects both the indeterminacy of the term sophist and the difficulty, at least for the everyday Athenian citizen, of distinguishing his methods from theirs. Secondly, Aristophanes' depiction suggests that the sophistic education reflected a decline from the heroic Athens of earlier generations. Thirdly, the attribution to the Sophists of intellectual deviousness and moral dubiousness predates Plato and Aristotle. In fact, it was probably thanks to a suspicion of Sophists and intellectuals in general that Socrates was killed in the first place, since, as we pointed out, most couldn't tell the difference. And it seems the Sophists themselves were aware of this general hostility. According to Plato, Protagoras himself says that, "For when one goes as a stranger into great cities, and there tries to persuade the best of the young men to drop their other connections, either with their own folk or with foreigners, both old and young, and to join one's own circle, with the promise of improving them by this connection with oneself, such a proceeding requires great caution, since very considerable jealousies are apt to ensue, and numerous enmities and intrigues." He also goes on to argue that teaching wisdom is nothing new. "Now I tell you that sophistry is an ancient art, and those men of ancient times who practice it, fearing the odium it involved, disguised it in a decent dress, sometimes of poetry, as in the case of Homer, Hesiod, and Simonides, sometimes of mystic rites and soothsayings, as did Orpheus, Musaeus, and their sex, and sometimes too, I have observed, of athletics, as with Iccus of Tarentum, and another still living, as great a sophist as any, Herodicus of Cylembria, originally of Megara. And music was the disguise employed by your own Agathocles, a great sophist, Pythocles of Chios, and many more. All these, as I say, from fear of ill will made use of these arts as outer coverings. But I do not conform to the method of all these persons, since I believe they did not accomplish any of their designs. For the purpose of all this disguise could not escape the able men of affairs in each city. The multitude, of course, perceive practically nothing, but merely echo this or that pronouncement of their leaders. Now to try to run away and to fail through being caught in the act shows sad folly in the mere attempt, and must needs make people far more hostile, for they regard such a one, whatever else he may be, as a rogue. Hence the road I have taken is one entirely opposite to theirs. I admit that I am a sophist, and that I educate men, and I consider this precaution of admitting rather than denying the better of the two. Plato shows that while a sophist may focus on teaching one particular skill, a teacher like Protagoras didn't think he was teaching only one skill, but virtue more broadly. But Plato also suggests that Protagoras was an outlier among sophists, since he has Protagoras say that, "The generality of them maltreat the young, for when they have escaped from the arts, they bring them back against their will and force them into arts, teaching them arithmetic, and astronomy, and geometry, and music. Whereas, if he applies to me, he will learn precisely and solely that for which he has come, that learning consists of good judgment in his own affairs, showing how best to order his own home, and in the affairs of his city, showing how he may have most influence on public affairs both in speech and in action. Indeed, not every sophist claimed to teach virtue. Just like Protagoras argued for the relativity of truth, rhetoricians like Gorgias argued that virtue was also relative to the individual and situation. In general, the label of sophist is pretty broad and unspecific, and quickly became simply an insult. But while Plato may have disliked the sophists, and portrays Socrates debating them, Socrates himself may not have been entirely against the sophists. In the dialogue Theages, Socrates suggests to a father who wants Socrates to train his son that sophists like Gorgias and Protagoras would be better instructors. And in the Theaetetus, he even says that he handed over many of his students to Protagoras and to other wise and inspired men. It is mainly because of Plato that such a wide distinction was made between philosophy and sophistry, and the fact that, as scholar Alexander Nehemos puts it, Socrates did not differ from the sophists in method but in overall purpose, meant that the distinction tended to focus on a difference in moral character. In fact, Diogenes Laertius credits Protagoras as being the first to develop the kind of argument known as Socratic, since he was known to teach people how to argue both sides of an argument. One of the main criticisms Plato has of the sophists is the fact that they charge for their teachings, and the Socrates we encounter in the dialogues makes sure to let us know that not only did he never charge, he didn't even claim to have any special knowledge or capacity to teach virtue. We'll be exploring what distinguished the sophists from more mainstream philosophers, along with whether it's even accurate to group them together, more in later videos in this series. For now, we're going to focus on the subject of the video, Protagoras. You may have heard his most famous saying, that man is the measure of all things, a phrase that has often been pointed to as the earliest expression of relativism, which is the view that knowledge, truth, and morality are not absolute and objective, but instead exist in relation to their cultural context. This idea probably horrified Plato, just like it horrifies the sort of religious thinking which needs a god to ground morality in objectivity. As Robin Waterfield says, Aristotle's response to all this is to claim that it destroys all sensible discourse. Plato's ad hominem response is to ask how Protagoras dared to set himself up as a teacher if all his pupils already had a grasp on the truth. But we'll see that the sophists in general, and Protagoras in particular, were not nearly as radical as they get made out to be. They certainly had some revolutionary ideas, but I don't think they were trying to destroy all sensible discourse, as Aristotle thought. The ability to argue both sides of the case, which Protagoras taught, probably by writing and getting his pupils to write model speeches defending either side, as an objective means of evaluating complex situations, was soon denigrated as the ability to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. This converts the neutral rhetorical claim, which Protagoras may indeed have made, to be able to take the two opposing arguments which are possible about anything and convert the weaker one into a winner, into the morally dubious claim to make the worse or morally more unsound argument defeat the more sound one. This pejorative version of Protagoras' claim became a kind of slogan of the opponents of the sophists, from comedians such as Aristophanes to philosophers such as Aristotle. Such responses ignore the clear value of the right to a good defense in court. Because man was the measure of all things, it was important to understand the language people used to express their truth, and therefore one of Protagoras' primary intellectual interests was orthopoeia, or the correct use of words, which would have been useful in interpreting laws and other court documents, such as contracts and wills. The power that the students of Sophists gained by being able to navigate the rhetorical world of the Athenian courts was certainly a factor in their bad reputation, comparable to the way people now might distrust a slick lawyer, as the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it. The rise of democracy essentially allowed these wise men to turn pro, charging substantial fees to this new market of young nobles who had a high demand for the skills that would make them effective politicians in the nascent assembly and law courts. This is why Protagoras is pointed to as the first professional sophist, since while Protagoras himself will tell you that the art of wisdom is nothing new, the act of charging for it was new, and this tutoring economy produced near celebrities like Gorgias, who gained so much wealth and fame that he was able to commission a gold statue of himself for a local temple. But of all the sophists, it's safe to say that Protagoras was also worthy of the title of philosopher, and perhaps his fame would be even greater if the title of sophist wasn't denigrated to such an extent by Plato. As Robin Waterfield puts it, Protagoras was a sophist, But he was also a philosopher. All the strands of his thought are interlinked and based on moderate skepticism. If we cannot be certain about the truth of a matter, then we are justified in arguing either side of the case. We are justified in agnosticism, and we are even justified in denying the possibility of falsehood. It seems likely to me that if more of Protagoras' written work had survived, we would be able to classify him more securely as a coherent and innovative thinker. At its most general, he appears to have claimed to teach people to be good citizens, but this needs to be diluted by the consideration that he priced himself out of the reach of most people, and so his aim is not as democratic as it sounds. He was, in fact, even if unwillingly, pandering to the political ambitions of the rich. Nevertheless, the very idea that good citizenship was something that could be taught, rather than something one inherited as a result of belonging to a family that had ruled for generations, was an important democratic innovation. While Protagoras is not as radical as he appears at first glance, his ideas are still pretty revolutionary. His greatest contribution to philosophy, in my opinion, is his political thought. In Protagoras, Plato puts into Protagoras' mouth an extended justification of the teachability of civic virtue, which may be an imitation or perhaps a development of what Plato found in Protagoras' own writings. Its main features are A, that civic virtue is teachable, B, a revolutionary, non-retributive deterrent penology, C, an emphasis on the role of rational argument within the state which effectively, for the first time in history, gives a theoretical basis for participatory democracy. These features too should probably be added to our picture of the historical Protagoras. However, it should also be noted that while Protagoras' ideal society may be democratic, it is not egalitarian, since he recognizes the need for experts in morality and politics. But again, Protagoras may have been more of a utilitarian and pragmatist than just some radical relativist. The denial of the possibility of falsehood is actually quite an extreme position, whereas Protagoras' claim to teach political virtue, if political virtue was not an entirely cynical paraphrase for whatever enables you to gain power in your particular society, does not suggest such an extreme position. After all, we can see why relativism might have become a suspect doctrine. It could be taken to mean that if a man believes it is right for him to kill his father, then for him, it is right to do so. However, it is unlikely that Protagoras himself would have agreed with this, and as a utilitarian democrat, he would have upheld the greatest good of the greatest number, which means that people cannot just go around killing and teasing if they feel so inclined. So in Protagoras' case, the idea that nothing is false must be modified. Though nothing is false, some beliefs are better than others, and in the political sphere, that means they are more conducive to utilitarian harmony. The noble purpose of the education Protagoras offered was presumably to bring about such an improved state of affairs. His most radical position, however, especially during the time when Socrates was famously executed for impiety, would have been his agnosticism. He famously said that, "Concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, or of what sort they may be. Many things prevent knowledge, including the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life." We'll be seeing Protagoras and his pragmatic philosophy again when we discuss the Platonic dialogue which is named after him. And as we go through the Sophists, we'll see the debate around nomos and physis, which was occurring in classical Athens. That is, the debate between whether justice and law is natural or just a custom, and what happens when natural desires conflict with the city's laws. But first, we'll be continuing our exploration of the final days of Socrates with another classic dialogue, Euthyphro. That's coming up next week. I hope you're excited, and I'll see you then.